The UK is trying to teach us how to run our country. Naturally, we resist that. We do not accept. We are not a British colony any longer. When we have difficulties, Britain has no right at all, to try and suggest to the rest of the world that we are a failure. Nor have they a right to try and suggest to us what we should do. We are not an extension.
Out digital IDs, arresting people for social media posts, hiking taxes while growth crumbles. No, it's not North Korea, it's the United Kingdom in 2025. The economy is weak, the state is getting more Orwellian, and the people paying for it are getting poorer or leaving. So today, we're breaking down just
No one in Britain imagined the fall would begin this way, not with a war, not with a crisis, but with one bold declaration from Africa that echoed louder than any political speech the UK had delivered in decades. Overnight, the continent Britain, once treated as dependent, made a move so decisive, so unapologetic, that the UK found itself standing alone on a global stage and it no longer controlled. Africa announced it would no longer carry Britain, no longer subsidize its industries through unfair trade routes, no longer prioritize British companies in booming African markets, no longer tolerate old agreements built on outdated hierarchies. And the moment the statement reached London, the shock was immediate. Supply chains cracked, markets trembled, investors fled, a silence swept through Parliament as leaders finally realized what they had ignored for years.
British isn't a thing. What is a British person? The Queen herself wasn't British. So what is a British person? They don't like immigrants, they don't like black people. This country is based off of immigrants and black people. Because immigrants and black people are the only people that are willing to do the jobs that white people ain't willing to do because it's below their class. And I feel like that's stupid. Because if it wasn't for your ancestors, your grandparents, my parents, other people who come from people who are not originated from the UK, what would the UK be? Because I don't see no English white man cleaning up the streets.
Africa wasn't asking for permission, partnership, or patience. Africa was done. Across Africa, celebrations erupted. A continent once underestimated was rising with unstoppable force, forming new alliances, building massive economic corridors, launching its own digital systems, and rewriting global power dynamics. Meanwhile, Britain, once a dominant force, was left scrambling for answers, struggling to adapt in a world where Africa no longer stood behind it but far ahead. The world watched as the impossible became reality. Africa wasn't breaking away from Britain. Britain was being left behind by Africa, and the fall of the UK had officially begun.
Of Britain, we have said, and so this is the main area of difference between them and ourselves. If there is any country we should now be considered for sanctions, is Britain for interfering in the domestic affairs of Zimbabwe. Well, the British have no standards apparently to guide them, and if they do, they would be misfiring. And since I'm here, I will take care of them.
The UK is officially over. In the UK, Labour will soon directly tax your bank accounts via withholding tax, and there is nothing you can do about it. Every British citizen and resident will now be forced to give their insurance number to their banks, which will allow the HMRC to directly tax your bank accounts. But the worst part is that this policy even allows the tax authorities to tax your savings account. I mean, it's not enough to
Britain had sensed the shift long before it was willing to admit it, but denial became a luxury it could no longer afford. For years, the UK relied on a quiet assumption that Africa would always remain within its orbit economically, politically, psychologically. It believed that historical ties, old trade routes, and nostalgic alliances were enough to keep a continent of more than 50 nations tethered to a system London once controlled effortlessly. But Africa was changing faster than Britain could comprehend. The continent that had been dismissed for decades was now a global powerhouse, unifying around shared interests, driving economic reforms at unprecedented speed, and forging strategic partnerships that left the UK stranded on the sidelines. Africa no longer wanted to be a market for Britain's outdated products, nor a backup supplier for industries Britain failed to modernize. The continent had outgrown its role as an extension of British influence. The breaking point came quietly, without the drama or tension the UK expected. It began with a simple announcement from the African Continental Council. Africa would no longer offer Britain preferential access to its markets, resources, or trade corridors, not because of hostility, but because Africa no longer saw Britain as essential. The statement struck London harder than any sanctions or diplomatic warning could have. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not asking for negotiations, assistance, or concessions. Africa was simply saying, "We don't need you anymore." Behind the scenes, British analysts worked frantically to understand how they had lost so much ground so quickly. Reports showed that African nations had steadily diversified their partnerships. China was now the largest investor in major infrastructure projects. The U.S. was working overtime to reconnect with African markets that it had previously underestimated. Middle Eastern powers were pouring billions into energy and manufacturing hubs across West and East Africa. Even South American nations had begun forging agricultural and tech alliances. Africa was no longer a quiet participant. It was the center of everything. The UK had not been prepared for this. Britain believed that its cultural ties, its education system, and its long-standing diplomatic networks were enough to maintain influence. But Africa's youth population, ambitious, educated, and rapidly connected, saw little value in the old relationship. They no longer wanted visas, second-hand opportunities, or lectures about development. They wanted partnerships that recognized Africa's value without conditions. As Britain's leverage crumbled, cracks began forming in its own political landscape. Leaders blamed each other for the strategic missteps. Some argued that Britain had focused too heavily on Europe, assuming Africa would simply wait. Others insisted that Brexit had stretched Britain's global reach too thin. But the truth was far simpler and far more painful. Britain underestimated Africa while the rest of the world embraced it. Africa's refusal to carry the UK any longer was not just economic, it was symbolic. For generations, Britain had positioned itself as a guiding force, offering advice, governance models, financial systems, and aid packages. But Africa now viewed those offerings as outdated and restrictive relics of a world order that no longer benefited the continent. Where Britain saw stability, Africa saw stagnation. Where Britain saw tradition, Africa saw imitation. The consequences for the UK were immediate. British factories dependent on African imports faced shortages. Food prices began rising as agricultural products from Africa were redirected to partners offering better terms. Pharmaceutical companies in Britain struggled as access to Africa's mineral supply chains tightened. Even British universities, once flooded with African students, saw an 80% drop in applications as African nations invested heavily in their own institutions and formed education exchanges with Asia and the Middle East. The cultural shift was even more dramatic. African media outlets, influencers, and public figures spoke openly about the continent's new direction, praising Africa's autonomy and celebrating the decline of outdated Western frameworks. Africa was rewriting the global rules, and Britain was discovering what irrelevance felt like. Within months, Africa announced a new economic pact with Asian and Middle Eastern partners, one that did not include Britain. The pact eliminated tariffs between participating nations, created shared investment zones, and ensured that Africa had full control over its resources and supply chains. Britain immediately requested observer status, but the request was politely declined. Africa was no longer interested in including its former overseer in decisions that shaped its future. London's political elite panicked. Parliament held emergency meetings. Analysts warned that Britain's economy was facing a long-term contraction. Some leaders insisted that the UK should apologize publicly to Africa and attempt a fresh start. Others bristled at the idea, refusing to accept the new balance of power, but Africa remained silent, silence that spoke louder than any declaration. Africa was not angry. Africa was not seeking revenge. Africa was simply moving forward, and Britain was no longer part of that future. As the weeks passed, Britain's financial markets trembled. The pound weakened. Major corporations relocated their Africa-facing operations to Asian capitals. Investors redirected capital to African megacities experiencing explosive growth. The UK found itself fighting for relevance in regions it once dominated effortlessly. The moment that fully exposed Britain's fall came when Africa announced its new continental energy grid, a massive renewable network spanning dozens of nations. The project was hailed globally as a technological breakthrough. China praised Africa's innovation. The US offered support. Even European nations lined up to participate. Britain was not invited. For the first time in generations, Britain was watching global progress from the outside, and Africa, confident, united, and rising, was leading the way. The UK could no longer deny it. The era of British dominance was over. Africa was not carrying Britain anymore. Africa was carrying itself. The shockwaves from Africa's decision continued to spread across Britain long after the first announcement faded from headlines. What began as a quiet shift had erupted into a national crisis, exposing just how deeply the UK depended on Africa in ways its citizens never realized. The country had built decades of economic assumptions on the idea that Africa would always be there, always providing, always cooperating, always accommodating. But Africa's refusal to carry the UK any longer forced Britain to confront a painful truth. It had mistaken dependency for stability. As African markets pivoted toward new alliances, Britain's trade routes grew increasingly fragile. Shipping companies reported massive delays at ports, especially for raw materials that once arrived effortlessly from African nations. Warehouses emptied faster than expected, and manufacturers across the UK were suddenly forced to scale back production. Industries that had relied on Africa's resources for decades were now scrambling to find alternatives, but alternatives came with higher prices, lower quality, and restricted volumes. Britain learned the hard way that replacing Africa was far more complicated than political speeches had suggested. In British supermarkets, consumers noticed the change before politicians did. Shelves once stocked with fresh produce imported from Africa now sat half empty. Prices climbed weekly. Households began rationing basic items. News outlets tried to frame the situation as temporary, but economists warned that Africa's shift was not a fluctuation. It was a long-term realignment. Britain was no longer at the center of Africa's trade strategy. It was no longer even on the first page. Across Africa, analysts and officials spoke openly about the reasons for the continent's bold stance. They explained that for too long, Africa had accepted trade deals that favored Britain excessively. For too long, the UK benefited from access to African markets without offering proportional investment or growth opportunities. Now, Africa was prioritizing partners who treated the continent as an equal force, and equality had never been part of Britain's approach. In London, pressure mounted on Britain's leaders to repair the relationship. Negotiators traveled across Africa attempting diplomatic outreach, but the reception was polite and distant. Africa was cordial but uninterested. The continent had moved on two larger projects with greater global impact: continental rail networks, green energy, corridors, digital payment integration, and resource sovereignty treaties. Britain's sudden urgency was met with a simple reality: Africa no longer had time for a partner whose interest only appeared after crisis. The UK attempted to salvage influence by offering new incentives, but Africa was no longer swayed by short-term promises. African nations understood their power. They understood the value of their minerals, agriculture, energy potential, and strategic location. Where Britain once dictated the terms, Africa now set the rules, and the rest of the world willingly participated. China expanded its investments into African energy and manufacturing hubs, rapidly filling the void Britain left behind. Middle Eastern nations deepened cooperation on agriculture and renewable energy. South American countries formed new trade lanes with Africa's emerging shipping alliances. Even European neighbors who once relied on Britain for diplomatic mediation now turned directly to Africa instead. Britain was isolated not because of Africa's anger, but because of Africa's confidence. Inside the UK, political divisions intensified. Citizens questioned why their leaders had not anticipated Africa's rise. Why had the UK failed to build a modern, equal partnership with the continent when it had the chance? Economists testified that Britain had grown complacent, relying too heavily on outdated systems and colonial legacies that no longer held relevance. Younger analysts argued that Britain had failed to recognize Africa's transformation because it never believed such transformation was possible. That mentality, they said, was the UK's downfall. But the deepest blow came when African nations announced a new global development bank headquartered in West Africa, designed to fund infrastructure, digital technology, renewable energy, and cross-border innovation. Dozens of countries applied to join. The UK submitted a request as well, hoping for observer status to begin repairing TES Africa declined, explaining that membership required demonstrated commitment to continental development, not political convenience. The rejection was so public, so symbolic, that it triggered waves of criticism throughout British media. Even Britain's cultural influence, long considered its strongest asset, began to erode. African entertainment industries, from film to music to digital storytelling, expanded rapidly across continents. African streaming platforms surged in Europe and Asia. African fashion houses opened flagship stores in major global capitals. Britain, once a cultural exporter, now found itself competing for relevance in markets it used to dominate effortlessly. The final blow to Britain's confidence arrived when African nations launched a shared digital currency for intercontinental trade. It was the first of its kind in the world, instant, inflation-resistant, built with blockchain precision, and controlled by African financial authorities rather than foreign institutions. The project drew global investment and admiration. Even countries in Europe expressed interest in integrating with the new digital system, but Britain was not included. This exclusion was not a punishment, it was a statement, a reminder that the world was shifting with or without the UK. Africa's rise was no longer a forecast, it was a reality shaping global affairs, and Britain, trapped in its own nostalgia, was struggling to keep up. Back in London, frustration boiled over. Protests erupted across major cities as citizens demanded answers for the country's economic decline. Businesses pleaded for immediate government intervention. Analysts called the situation unprecedented. Britain had not simply lost influence, it had lost access, opportunity, and relevance. The fall was deeper than political embarrassment. It was structural. Meanwhile, Africa continued to rise with unstoppable momentum. Megacities expanded, innovation clusters flourished. New universities attracted global talent. Continental manufacturing became highly competitive. African airlines dominated new flight routes. African energy grids powered entire regions sustainably. African corporations listed on global stock exchanges with record valuations. Africa was no longer emerging. Africa had arrived. Britain's difficulty came not from Africa's rise, but from the realization that it had built its future on assumptions rather than strategy. Africa refused to carry Britain any longer because Africa was carrying its own destiny and thriving. As British officials met once again in emergency sessions, hoping to regain even a fragment of the influence they once possessed, the truth echoed across political offices, boardrooms, and newsrooms. The fall of the UK was not caused by Africa leaving, it was caused by Britain never believing Africa could rise.